Good afternoon. My name is Michael Hathorn. I'm the chairman of the board of directors for CNU Utah. As you may already be aware, CNU Utah is the newest local chapter of the Congress for New Urbanism. Internationally, CNU is recognized as the leading organization for promoting walkable mixed-use neighborhood development, sustainable communities, and healthier living conditions. Really, CNU Utah has defined its mission as one to educate, advocate, and implement the principles of CNU's charter as they pertain to our particular needs here in our beautiful state. More specifically, CNU Utah strives to educate its members and the public about the mission and purposes of CNU, and projects and programs that further the purposes and principles of CNU, after the principles of CNU, and further the application of CNU principles in communities among members, allied professionals, civic leaders, and decision makers. Support membership in implementing best practices and projects while also working to recognize professionals who amplify and advance the purposes and principles of CNU. As these efforts, CNU Utah has successfully held a number of webinars on topics that we have felt provide benefit to relevance to us right now. Let's continue today with the webinar that we have arranged for and through the generosity of our speaker, Scott Polikoff. Polikoff is a community planner and national leader advancing the new economics of place. Known nationally for his work in unlocking the true value of neighborhoods through focusing on public-private partnerships to fund lasting design. Scott started his professional life with patent bogs practicing law in Washington, D.C. His careers in the established Gateway Planning Group to undertake a national urban planning and design practice focused on the marriage of walkable places and the economics of transportation. Specific to our topic today, Scott's been able to successfully pinpoint the means by which to effectively communicate the economic development benefits that exist within the makeup and operation structure of these codes. Scott graciously offered his time and knowledge to us here this afternoon to share what he has learned through a myriad of projects that demonstrate these economic development outcomes through the use of form-based codes. I turn the time over to Scott. I would like to ask and remind all of our participants today to please keep your microphones on mute so as to minimize the amount of audio disruption during the presentation portion of the webinar. Your assistance with this will be greatly appreciated. If you have questions for Scott, they can be submitted to our Q&A portion of the webinar. Use the chat tool in the lower right-hand corner of your screen or Twitter at #CNUUtah. With that, I would now like to turn the time over to Scott.
Thank you. It's great to be on this webinar for two reasons. One, this webinar and using form-based codes for economic development is a teaser for the Code Institute 3-1 course that'll be held in Salt Lake City, and I'll put more information about that at the end of the presentation. I'm also on the Form-Based Code Institute National Board and the CNU National Board, and as a member of the National Board of CNU, it was my honor to be the liaison from the board for the local host committee for the Salt Lake City Congress 2 years ago in the greater Wasatch Front region. And I thought that was a great Congress. So if you who helped volunteer for that, I surely are on this call, and thank you for that. This thing is used by a lot of folks, but it basically demonstrates that this on the left is our conventional approach to zoning, which is viewed as more regulatory and adversarial. The approach on the right, where a form of the neighborhood, how buildings sit on the lots and parcels, how they frame spaces between one another or frame the street, are paramount in terms of the structure of an entitlement to a form-based approach versus a traditional approach using separated uses. I like to call the form-based approach the de facto master developer, because you can gather a destination in a larger area and across multiple ownerships, which is oftentimes the benefit of having a large single-owned master plan community. And you can get that through form-based and still have small investors and small ownerships. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why I love using form-based planning and zoning, because it allows us to do what master developers and master plan community artisans once did years ago. Days of assembling large amounts of land are no longer viable because it's hard to borrow money for those kinds of investments. But this tool allows you to create more predictability from it parcel to parcel, and I think that's what hopefully you'll learn from today through some of the examples I'm showing. We're not going to go into too much detail about the mechanics of the form-based codes themselves, but I'm going to show you how we use the codes for specific objectives, redevelopment or new development, that also has an economic development benefit in terms of attracting higher quality jobs, creating more investment opportunities so that the public sector is motivated to invest in infrastructure, the private sector is motivated to invest in infrastructure, and importantly, that the agreement between the neighborhoods, the developer, and the public sector on how that infrastructure should be designed. The urban design of the plan and of the coding becomes the common vocabulary to create a destination, places for people. If that correctly, I believe what we've set up for redevelopment or new development in the modern era is ability for those places to regenerate. In other words, the traditional suburban model is it's designed, the site and the buildings for a mall. And so when the mall is no longer viable, we have to scrape, and the infrastructure design is no longer is capable of regenerating. The form-based planning and zoning approach, we create ability from generation to generation for regeneration. In other words, instead of zoning for a static guess at what the UB and the market should be, we're embracing the notion that everything changes over time. Or we can set up a preservation of the things that are great, and we to destroy the bases and buildings that will endure by intention in order to prevent the overall destination. And that's key to long-term economic development. And I think specifically when we're talking about redevelopment, and see in this picture below, I'll talk about this community in a little bit, Little Roanoke, Texas, north of Fort Worth, but that's a construction, that's a reinvented street. And it's a building in a new context, but it's building on the authenticity of an older place, and hopefully that's set up to be here another 100 years and not just another 20. And again, as I said, is the form-based approach. And by the way, when I said planning and coding, I meant that's key. You can't just adopt a form-based code. You have to plan it and then calibrate the code from the planning. In the development environment, the key, I think, is focusing on building on prior investment and reinforcing authenticity. I want to say it again, building on prior investment and reinforcing authenticity. So an example of one recent effort, a small community southeast of Austin called Bastrop on the Colorado River. This is the Texas Colorado River. You can see it through from the northwest down to the southeast. This is where the new near where the new Formula One racetrack is and the airport. Bastrop has a historic downtown on the Colorado River. There's an incredible amount of potential. It's a linear downtown with the main street that runs parallel to the river. There's an SDAT. Volunteers came in from around the country and said, how can you move this downtown into the modern era and preserve what's great about this downtown, which is being encircled by this explosive growth of Central Texas, not too dissimilar to the small communities in the county and the Wasatch Front and other areas of greater Salt Lake City region, where growth is coming and it's going to affect everyone. And how do you reinforce and provide for redevelopment of the historic centers, whether they're neighborhood centers or downtowns? And one of the conclusions from the SDAT was, and this was the notes that we picked up before we were involved in this project, form-based code allows community. And I think it's the point about regeneration as opposed to a regulatory or adversarial role. We're going to have a convenience store in the corner, and we're going to do an apartment complex over here, and we're going to put a gate around it, and whether the gate is for people to either break into the apartments or to break out of the apartments. But so I love that. Form-based code allows community. The SDAT also established, I think, long-term goals, and you can see the historic downtown just above the river and larger, greater downtown area, and that's Highway 71 to the right, which comes back and leads to Austin. I think the key was, and we use these as our guideposts for this redevelopment initiative using base, linking vision and the market, critical. Consumers of places, placemaking and development real estate are linkage in the market because the consumer wants walkable places. Leveraging prior investments, as I said, historic cores have a lot of things right that were done 70 to 100, 150 years ago, and this notion of predictability. And by predictability is that a block in a downtown, and I want to go borrow money to build a new building on that block, but I'm the block next to me. I don't know what's going to happen next to me under a conventional suburban zoning regime applied to a historic downtown, which is typical of a lot of places in America today. Then the underwriting process, my debt source and my equity sources are going to say, I'm not going to loan you the money or give you equity because I don't know what's going to happen next door. It's going to blow out our investment. With ACE, it creates the adjacency predictability so that even if you don't control the block next door, you have the ability to understand under form-based what's going to happen next door. And their value is going to support your value, and your value is going to support their value. So these are the different influence areas that you have to set up when you start the planning process. You can see that the SDAT area was the red around the core downtown. But there was an effort several years ago to look at the original Old Town Plat, which is the lighter green-yellow. And there was a Main Street initiative. Question at the beginning of the planning process was, what's the planning area? And we said to the city, let's have the courage not to establish it at the very beginning. Let it go organically as we go through the process, understanding what stakeholders believe should be the influence area for the downtown redevelopment initiative. We market study, Catalyst Commercial, Jason Clonch, who once worked for Billingsley Company Development. Lucy Billingsley started that company. She's the daughter of Trammell Crow. Catalyst did a market summary for us to really understand how much new development was possible. Now, this as a conservative estimate. The reason this is important is, see, look at it, says 40 to 60 units demand of new residential annually for the greater downtown. That's not a lot. And so what that is, you're not as a designer in 1,000 units of 4 to 5 story urban residential when the market's only going to absorb maybe, let's say 40 to 60 is doubled 100 a year. So market analysis helps us calibrate the proper planning. I looked at and assessed what's already in place and what's working along Main Street, along the Chestnut corridor that approaches the Main Street. You can see upper right, there's actually a new planned cultural center that's not in place yet. A lot of historic fabric and homes that have been converted. The upper shows the an old station that's just ripe to become a beer garden. A series of interviews where around a map and aerial, we took note after note after note with meeting after meeting to just understand the politic of the market and the culture of downtown. We started looking at the framework. What are the current transportation patterns? Where are people walking? What are the streets currently? What might they look like in the future in terms of redevelopment or preservation, depending on which part of downtown you're looking at? And how do they relate to the major highways that frame the greater downtown? One of what we did, though, is we said, look, Main Street, and this is the view, you can see the aerial down, most of the historic building fabric is still there. Main Street, it was basically just saying, how can we code this for preservation without encouraging too much change? And in this code we developed, we focused on the process of reinforcement versus the process of redevelopment. Then, in building scale analysis, and you can see left is Main Street, and that's not corridor approaching Main Street from one of the state highways to the right. Started looking at what would be an infill pattern that could accommodate both the culture and preference of the current market, but reinforces the historic neighborhood patterns, a block north and a block south, and 2 blocks north and 2 blocks south. And also, what's the cadence of the development that would occur as it crescendos towards historic Main Street? This is illustrative, but if you, I believe, in the form-based approach, don't go to the building scale and to design analysis, it's very difficult to calibrate form-based codes. for development. Looked at the various additional neighborhoods around the core of downtown, and went back and we started refining our connectivity strategy in terms of infrastructure. All that added to the creation of a regulating plan, which has what we call character zones. If you're using the SMART code, it is essentially the transects. But in this case, we didn't use a transect-based code. We used just a code that we created from scratch so that each character zone really bring the authentic fabric to these different distinct areas. And so you can see the dark brown to the left for 3 blocks is the historic Main Street. The mixed use is around it in the lighter brown. As you go into the neighborhoods, and then there's an old courthouse area that has a lot of converted businesses, and we call that the commercial mixed use, and we have some transition areas. And then we started to flesh out the character of each of the details of the character of each of these character zones. So, for example, the neighborhood professional office, which is the yellow area around the old historic Main Street and the house, we start looking at the scale and types of uses that might be allowed. Remember, form-based is still regulating uses, but not as a primary regulation. But you characterize and categorize the uses for each character zone that would be allowed as a matter of right. The various transition areas, and remember also, form-based coding focuses on transitions within the neighborhood versus buffers. That's power from an economic development standpoint. With buffers, you lose the opportunity for that fine-grained experience, the people experiences, the better architecture, the more fine-grained infill. If you use buffers and walls and hiding things versus transitions, like townhomes, for example, as you can see here, which we're coding for, so from the more commercial development to the single-family, code it for townhomes and show how the townhomes can be developed. That's much better than walls and the heavy landscaping buffers. Code itself is broken down into fairly simple component parts. Lighting plan, we use the early planning as an illustrative vision and actually go through the actual elements. And so in this code, the use of it is pretty simple. We locate the property on regulating plan. Step 1, character zone is it in. We then determine what type of frontage does it have, and what we mean by that is economic development benefits of form-based codes is to tie together the frontages in front of the buildings and the frontages that are the transitions to the street itself, and that's the pedestrian zones or the hangout areas. And we code both to ensure that we align the context and character and function of the private frontages, the forecourts or the entryways, and the cafe environments to the public elements of the pedestrian zones. In higher priority corridors, we want to make sure that there might be a minimum amount of facade that needs to go across the front of the block, but we tend not to overemphasize that because in the modern era, high parking still oftentimes required and makes sense for small businesses. Within that character zone, you look for what is a entitled right, use as a matter of right, and it tells you in that character zone what uses you can do. And then we metaphor in the code of the body, clothing, accessory, or jewelry. The first, you look in using the code where the body of it, where looking down onto the diagram, each section says where can the building land, where can you set it back or set it to the property line, where is the parking going to be allowed, and where's the pedestrian zone. Similarly for the vertical elements, what's the height and what are the basic appurtenances relative to the buildings themselves. Then we code for what we could call the clothing, where the basic materials and functional architectural requirements. Do you have to have a shop front design, a sufficient minimum amount of windows so that the building says, I'm here, come to me? What kind of basic elements do you need in terms of materials? And in a redevelopment environment, we allow for a lot of different materials instead of trying to overly prescribe them. Accessories to things that in the pedestrian realm are, yes, more the responsibility of the public sector, but you want to make sure that even though these are not required because they're in the code, because the public sector from a health and safety standpoint can always make these changes. Just because we show street trees in this particular diagram for this location. That doesn't mean that the engineering or public works department has to put them exactly there. But this is sort of a moral commitment because it's adopted in the code by the city that we will have street trees and we will have a pedestrian zone in this location. And then minor modifications so that if a particular block and building shows that build-to line can't be adhered to, they're off by 5 feet or 8 feet, why make the applicant rezone because the applicable build-to line for the building can't be adhered to? The city manager, his or her designee, or the planning director administratively make those modifications as long as the intent of the code is allowed. This is huge for economic development. If you make a small investor or property owner go through a 6-month variance process or rezoning, that may be the difference of their willingness and capacity financially to actually do a great small project. Ultimately, we believe that if your community doesn't allow for administrative approval of the plans that are generated after zoning, then if the phased approach really gives you the ability to create enough certainty, staff should be able to review them to see if they're consistent with the overall tool. So under this approach in Bastrop, you submit the site plan and building permit application, staff reviews it. If it's fine, the site development and building permits are issued. Now, some people and some communities still want to go through a public hearing for site plan, but if the form-based code is done carefully enough with enough site detail, then we believe that from an economic development standpoint, if the market adheres to the essential rules of the form-based code, then we believe that they should go on ahead and do administrative approval. And besides, if staff doesn't believe that the details have been appropriately applied to the site plan, they can say we're not going to approve it, and then an appeal can be taken to the Planning Commission or to City Council. It was adopted as a rezoning of over 100 square blocks of downtown Bastrop just 2 weeks ago, adopted unanimously by the City Council. Working in Bonanza Park with Christy Alexander and her team there and the council and the Planning Commission, we've been working for several years. We hope that ultimately the code that's been calibrated over the last year or so is taken up for consideration. I think a vision that reinforces the opportunity for this 100-acre area of Bonanza Park that sort of has some great development in it. It's as you come into town on your way to the resort there in Parks, area that built up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. There was a vision developed as part of the general plan process before we got involved that had a strong perspective on creating a place for the local community. Typically, all the locals go to the historic Main Street. A lot of times, the locals want to go find a place that's got more kind of funky, locally focused businesses, and Bonanza Park was targeted as this place, and also a place to increase the housing for the local community. And so it was a set of planning principles adopted in the plan for Bonanza Park, connecting the history, form partnerships, improving circulation because it has a suburban pattern where it's hard to walk through and cycle through Bonanza Park, redevelopment in a sustainable manner, and Bonanza Park was then, with this early planning, a vision was made to use a form-based code, and we think that's a powerful tool to deliver the vision and the goals of the community, City Council, and the Planning Commission. This early concept that was developed, pretty dense concept, this would be consistent with the VIN. And then when we got involved, we started doing additional plans to test the original vision that was adopted by Park City community. We did a boulevard option as opposed to a diagonal option. We got the spur park being the central location where the old railroad used to come in. We looked at a revised boulevard option. We received from hundreds and hundreds of interviews and stakeholder meetings, but stakeholders that were engaged through a series of meetings over a 2-year period, the feedback in the planning process. That resulted in the development of a series of character zones, similar to the one we saw in Bastrop, and then we did a development regulating plan from those character zones. The reason I'm showing Park City is because I think there's more opportunity to implement form-based code based on the process that we used in Bastrop, where we take the character of what's existing as you come in Park on the way into city. You can reinforce the potential of the existing place as a resort gateway, but also it becoming more of a neighborhood focus for everything behind it. More use, the integration of a variety of residential so that you can begin to create a larger option for locals in terms of residential types. But a lot of them don't necessarily want more of the resort living. They want to live in a more of an urban residential environment. And there's this industrial environment called Iron Horse, which is functioning very well, the opportunity to reinforce the small businesses that already exist there. And the regular plan then had a series of elements put together, but the challenge was height. And so the discussion today about the final calibration and adoption of the form-based code for Bonanza Park down to the question of there's the entitlement of 2 to 3 stories. Do we go above that? And if we allow somebody to go above it, what are they willing to do to go above it? That discussion is currently in process, and whether we go to 4 or 5 stories. What the discussion ends with a decision to stay at 3 stories or to allow to go for more than 3 stories, we still think the form-based approach is the way to create a better amendment of broadening the market options for the local community in Park City. But even if you don't, once you adopt the form-based code, is in a more suburban environment where you have a lot of disconnection, you don't have a series of connected blocks, is we make the connection through reinvention of the street network. That's where the economic development element needs to be reinforced. The itself still may not be fully utilized unless the network is reinvented. So working with Parsons Brinkerhoff, Gateway Planning did an analysis with Interplan on what additional roadway connections could be made to the redevelopment of Bonanza Park. We made a cost estimate, and now the City Council, in conjunction with the form-based code, is going to consider whether or not they should invest in better connected street network with more walkable streets to complement the form-based code as an incentive to support higher quality, more variety, and the creation of a place that is more oriented for the local community than the resort. The ability to scale up or down the forced approach. In Texas, just north of Fort Worth, there is a street called Oak Street. This is a town of 7,000. It's a place that has essentially lost its, when we got involved, lost its character, except for it had a great little restaurant called Babe's Chicken House, which would attract 1,000 people. People stand in line for 3 hours on Saturday to go have dinner. They would end up just hanging out in the street. It was very dangerous because nobody knew where to walk or where to park, and then eat, and then they would leave. So looked at the historic and authentic past of what was or once the working class community, and we started looking at the development patterns. You can see the original plat to the right, and every time you do redevelopment, we think that the form approach needs to look at the original form and build on what existed then. We also looked at the cultural history. This was where Bonnie and Clyde would visit, because Bonnie was actually from Roanoke. And the right-hand building is the old bank building where the vault where her family's money was kept. Is one of the few banks that actually was never robbed by them, because back then they didn't have deposit or insurance. They would have been robbing their own family's money. But these are the important things that I think create the basis for the calibration of the code. So our strategy was, how do you build on the destination traffic of Dave's and another great restaurant? The process of planning, what would the infill potential be? You can see with this figure ground, there's a series of pocked, mainly empty parcels. The blacker the existing buildings, and you can see the infill based on our market analysis. It had a form-based code that was simple. long. It's only about 15 pages because it's a small area. It wasn't a complicated code. We did a study to calibrate that code, and we did a scenario to say, okay, what do we need to do to create a more walkable environment on Oak Street? If you look back at this image, right here, it connects property to property, parcel to parcel, or building to building. It's a suburban environment in what could be a walkable, urban, walkable place. We went back and looked at the design potential, and you can see our master plan was then turned into a schematic by half, working with the engineers. And this is 2 years old now. Actually, it's much more developed. But by bringing the form-based code and reinventing the street under that schematic, you can see we reconstructed the street. We form-based environment to create the continuity going down the street of the frontages of the buildings, both in terms of the private frontages and the public frontages. And you can see how redevelopment started to occur immediately under the vision of the original plan. And by the way, Abe's is still there, and it's rocking. Also, to the right, you can see that's the mayor's dad's car wash. So the nitty-gritty stuff doesn't have to go away. Someday, when the quarters that the mayor's dad collects are out by the value of the property, he'll probably either part somebody or sell that property under the form-based strategy. Today, Roanoke is rocking, and a sense of the impact of that. In 2006, just the land itself was valued at $4 per square foot, and just 6 years later, the tax assessor valued it at $12 a foot. And there are now about 10 restaurants, and they're adding another restaurant or two every year, and they're generating about $600 a square foot in sales plus, which, for those of you in the business of retail and restaurants, for small mom and pop or regional restaurants, $600 a square foot in sales is very, very good, and many of them are exceeding some of the best sales in all of Dallas-Fort Worth are occurring in restaurants, and that's the new city logo. You can see how the form-based strategy translates directly into economic development. They're naming themselves the unique dining capital of Texas. And by the way, you can see that tower was decommissioned, and when we got involved about 9 years ago, they were going to tear it down. We encouraged them to spend money to keep it up because it's to be any better wayfinding. It's the old historic water tower. And so they've now incorporated it into their logo. There's a parcel at the end of Oak Street, about 20 acres, and now set up for it to become a mixed-use development opportunity. And the owner is waiting for a developer to make a proposal. The city is committed to build a new city hall in the middle of that 20 acres at the end of Oak Street. So this together, economic development, civic reinvention, creation of walkability, and now created a cluster of restaurants that all entrepreneurs can participate in instead of having a single master plan community or a mall. And people drive to Roanoke now just to say, let's go to Roanoke and hang out, and when we get there, we'll decide what restaurant to go to. That's the success of redevelopment is when you encourage this kind of entertainment and restaurant environment, when you're no longer having people that go down to a place to go to a particular restaurant, they place knowing that when they get there, they've got options and choices. They'll figure it out when they get there. Fine, and I'll try and complete this in the next few minutes so we have time for questions and answers. We used form-based for an economic development strategy in Richardson, Texas, in order to create the opportunity to attract a significant employment opportunity. Form-based for greenfields as opposed to redevelopment is, I think, it has some additional economic development principles that you're creating destinations instead of projects, oftentimes across multiple ownership again. It can encourage the private sector to emphasize public spaces through the form-based that are oftentimes just thought of in landscape entries, monumentation, and a few parks outside that are really never useful. And so this gives the ability for landowners to sell to vertical developers and others at a premium. You can create more value both for the horizontal development and the vertical development. So this is a story of a project called Sea Line. This is a build-a-suit for the new real estate firm headquarters in Dallas-Fort Worth here in Richardson, Texas. This is a 200-acre area that's last remaining undeveloped property at the time in Richardson, Texas. In Dallas, if you go from Dallas, you go north and you cross in up the Central Expressway 75, you cross into Richardson. Then you go into Plano. So this is you see the toll road going left and right. The toll is the dividing line north and south of Richardson, Plano. The 200 acres on the southeast corner was held in a trust fund for one of the kids of the royal magnate Hunt, and so it was sold to my clients out of his trust, and it was in a great location. It's on the Richardson Dart line, but the acreage on an existing Dart station with two highways was really developed because it had old conventional single-use zoning for apartments and office, but no mixed use and no real place making. And so what we did is we went through a process again of creating and understanding the caliber and understanding the character. There's creeks that run through it. There's major arterials that divide it, and that be reinvented and designed. So the question was, what's going to drive value both for the developer and be a benefit to the city instead of just being a basic developer deal? And what we were able to determine was that if we use form-based, we can create a place instead of just a series of projects, reach the corner, an office building behind, garden apartments behind that. And of course, up in these suburbs, like in many locations around the greater Salt Lake area, the communities in the suburbs are afraid of just another apartment deal. In other words, saying, yeah, you're talking about mixed use, but what you're really talking about is apartments. And what we thought was, how can we engage the neighborhood to say, doesn't Richardson, Texas, in this location deserve a cool live, work, play environment? So I have to drive out of this location to go have a great dinner in another part of DFW. And so ultimately, we went through the process of starting to create a framework so that if it was zone form-based, pieces could be sold off within a great framework in terms of the natural environment, more walkable streets, and access to the. We did look at, again, using form-based for our client who was not a vertical developer but wanted to entitle it and sell it to a vertical developer for them to create more value so that it could be sold off. The goal was to create more tax base from the mixed-use environment, and the conventional zoning wasn't attracting that mixed-use environment. And so the decision was made for us to use a privately initiated form-based approach. Through a calibration process, again, to test the market potential and what could really go on the site. And what is that the gold markets are actually looking today in terms of form-based. They're actually looking for places that appeal to millennials, Generation X, and Generation Y. As 10 years ago, they were really looking for cheap land and maximum city incentives. Today, we're in a global talent war, and the real estate decisions in these communities to create really attractive places for centers is driving the corporate real estate decisions. And so this was an opportunity to really focus on how to make this last remaining undeveloped part of Richardson a competitive place to attract a job center. This is called the Telecom Corridor, which started with the advent of Texas Instruments headquarters 60 years ago. But we're starting to see leakage of major companies out of the area. So what we did is we applied a form-based zoning to the site, connecting the streets within the FERC development that could occur, and how that development could over to the rail station. And you see over there by the rail station that to the upper left, you can see the line. That's the Dart line that you can get on today, literally, and go to downtown Dallas or up to Plano, Texas. You can see we create a framework for the connection of the streets to the rail line. But this form-based code was adopted. And code was adopted, and we started looking at the ability to sell off portions of the form-based code, and the code allowed us to sell the lower 18 acres to a high-quality mixed-use developer for urban residential called Sale Corson. And the key to that was that whoever developed north of them would be much more focused on quality than on selling off a quick buck, low-quality development. And then what happened was that remaining land became very attractive because it now had a live, work, play environment on it. And State Farm was looking for a new regional headquarters, and the build-a-suit developer named KDC, Coal Development, been retained to look for a new mixed-use campus for State Farm. State Farm wanted a place for build-a-suit of their campus that would have highway access, great convenient transit access, mixed use, live, work, play attractions for employees, and predictable entitlements, which the form-based code would enable. And so ultimately, the form-based code gave the KDC build-a-suit developer the idea to bring the State Farm project to this location. That's when, yes.
We're getting a little bit of feedback. I don't know if that's if from you or from one of the other callers, but it's kind of a sketchy effect. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a look at that.
Yeah,
it's better way now. So yes, okay, that's better. Thank you.
So state's looking for a new corporate location, and their request for transit access as to highways, mixed use, and live, work, play to attract the best and the brightest. And so that in Coal Development said to our site. And the problem was Coal Development would not have ever gone to the conventional site that I showed you in the conventional zoning. But by applying the form-based planning and coding to the site, it made it attractive to purchase the property from our clients at a premium, and they called this new development city line. And so it's not just, quote, a State Farm office campus. It's a corporate mixed-use employment center for farm, and you can, this is the development plan to the left of 50 acres with the Corson mixed-use multifamily at the bottom. We're hired by ADC to extend the form base further for the rest of the acreage. And you can see today that it is now a mixed-use urban walkable area. And buildings you see in the upper left, those three buildings are now constructed, and State Farm will be moving into this live, work, play environment very soon. So this is a great example of how convening wasn't between the kind of development mentioned that great location with a rail line and highways should have attracted. But by converting it through form-based to a live, work, play environment, it became attractive for investment in a new corporate headquarters. It gives us a privately initiated form-based code that was written the application of our client, the horizontal developer, and we worked hand in glove with the city of Richardson to calibrate it so that it worked for the public spaces and the public interest. So that closed by saying, if you're interested in more details about how to do the form-based planning and coding, there's a Form-Based Code Institute course, 301 in Salt Lake City, which is an advanced course. Peter Parker's the former planning director of Denver, Larry Madden of Farrell Madden, Bill Russell, who's the executive director of the Form-Based Code Institute. Go to the Form-Based Code Institute website. You can register advanced multi-day course. Also would invite you to join this year's Congress that was held 2 years ago in Salt Lake City for the Congress for the New Urbanism here in Dallas-Fort Worth at the end of the month. If you want more information, go to cnu23.org. I'd love to have you here. There's an incredible amount of great walkable urbanism, old urbanism, and new urbanism here, and some of the best innovation in real estate around the country in the Sun Belt. We'd encourage you to come. Planned at either airport airport and to train into Dallas for the Congress. We actually have a lot of capacity in the region. So with that, I'd be happy to turn it over for question and answer.
Thank you very much. We do have some questions, and I want to remind anybody that's listening, if you'd like to submit a question, you can do that using either the chat tool within the WebEx application, or you can use Twitter at CNU Utah. Here's a few questions to run with to start with, Scott. The first question is, what monetized proof have you seen that shows you can take form-based code to the bank with isolated parcels within a form-based code?
Well, what's, for example, in Roanoke is that now when somebody wants to do a restaurant, they go that they are opening a restaurant on a single parcel, but they can show the track record of the connecting to the other restaurants through the essential reinvented fabric of downtown. And so it's as if they actually are part of a larger restaurant cluster, but they can do it as single investor or operator. We're seeing restaurant after restaurant and small business open in Roanoke. They're getting financing without any problems whatsoever. Location that's 30 miles north of Fort Worth in an old or community that's sort of off the beaten path.
The question was actually tied specifically to Roanoke, and so maybe this is a good time to ask that one. It references the numbers that you gave in terms of the value, the tax assessed value per square foot in Roanoke, $4 a square foot in 2006, going to over $12 a square foot in 2012. Do you have examples of comparables for the same time? And then, how did the Great Recession play into those values also?
Well, that's a question. I have direct comparables because Roanoke is one of 175 communities around Dallas-Fort Worth, and they're all different. But I can tell you there's a lot of small communities around Dallas-Fort Worth that during that same time frame, their property values in their downtowns remained flat or they lost value because that period was during the recession and just coming out of the recession, 2006 to 2012. But values increased consistently through recession there because there's still an economy, as there is in many places, where the old values were either flat or reducing, positioned to weather the storm by actually increasing value because we made it an attractive place. So as demand was still there for restaurants and some entertainment, it became a place where that investment and that demand was attracted in because it was easy and it was a very comfortable place for the restaurants to occur because they related to one another through the placemaking of the form-based strategy and the redesign and reconstruction of Oak Street. Whereas if you had a restaurant idea and went to some urban location and tried them down in isolation, you probably were able to find cheaper land, but you wouldn't necessarily be in a place where that would have been very successful unless you're in a core, so like in Dallas or in one of the suburbs or of a larger size, like in Plano, where there's jobs in a big larger corporate area, corporate cluster. So this also creates the ability for communities to sort of create a recession-proof environment. So there's smaller communities, if they could make it easy for businesses to invest together and cluster together without any one person having to own too much, that is a diversification strategy. So not everything lost value or rose in value the same in this area, but I think Livingtown Roanoke outperformed because of the putting together the de facto master development context we created for that stretch of downtown.
Looking at the, I guess using the case studies that you presented to us, if you were to boil down the, I guess you'd say would be, what would you say the key advantages code are as it pertains to their use as an economic development tool? What would be take homes in terms of advantages that are associated with it.
Just the form-based planning and coding, whether it's over just one corridor or over an entire neighborhood or an entire sector, it binds together property to property, block to block, street to street, aesthetically, and culturally. Then what you've done is you've reduced the risk that any one development or project within that area is going to have to rise or fall on its own set of attributes. It creates, like I said earlier, the adjacency predictability, which is in real estate development and investment, and from an economic development standpoint, when you go to the underwriting process where as to whether or not somebody's investment or loan is going to be approached within a set of risk profiles, which are basically reducing the risk of any one development project or businesses within that context, because they're going to have to rise or fall. You know that in a form-based environment, that if you invest and add value to a building or a public space or a block or two blocks, that whatever he's going to do down the street or whatever another developer is going to do down the street, their development is going to reinforce your value, and your value is going to reinforce their value, and that creates a long-term, sustainable, predictable environment for investment. So that block-to-block predictability of value is my main key takeaway of the power of the form-based code.
The question about the economics of phasing form-based code projects. How the first developer to invest when values are lower?
I'm going to fully understand the question, Mike. What do you think is being what they're trying to get at in that question? Can you help me?
It's Mike. This is Diego. Basically, I guess what I'm trying to find out is you talked about the benefits of being able to parcel out developments. But what challenges in developing a form-based use development is that it will come and take the first investment, not just to get the code rewritten, but to come in and maybe the infrastructure. So you talked about how that's a benefit of form-based code, but how do you get that first developer to come in and take those first few parcels, develop those first few parcels?
That's a question. Well, in Roanoke, what we did is we made the case that the form-based code would actually create higher tax base, higher sales tax, higher property tax. Therefore, we should consider paying for redesign and reconstruction as a common piece of infrastructure of Oak Street under the form-based vision. That is an incentive for the first investors to come in and redevelop buildings, either restaurants. So it effectively created a return of risk for them to come in as the first investor. In the case of the greenfield environment of City Line, what we did is we negotiated an incentive package where if value was created from development, the city would reimburse the developer to help pay for some of the infrastructure. So allowed them to actually promise a higher level of amenity and attract the tenant base of State Farm, which was a key way to reduce the risk of being first in. I would say that the key is that the form-based code is used to show that more tax base is going to be generated than traditional or conventional zoning on that site, creating a destination that's a place instead of just a series of ad hoc projects that may live or die on their own because isolated, a center or apartment behind it or whatever. In the based environment, we were able to project that the city and the county is going to acquire more taxes over time, gave them the political motive, in the case of Roanoke, to invest directly in the street infrastructure. In the case of Richardson, to say that if the tax base grows over a certain level, that they would get reimbursements for some of the infrastructure.
Speak really loud.
I was curious, how did they do the taxing mechanism of financing benefit rates? So how did they do RDA on a essentially what?
Did you?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah.
I was curious about the tax increment financing package that you alluded to on the Richardson site? Nice how that was done, if it was done through an EA, like would be typical here in Utah, but done on a greenfield site, and if so, how they managed to get an RDA greenfield site, or what the story behind that was?
Increment financing authority in Texas is more liberal than Utah, and basically they've reached the requirement to show blight, and so it basically more in the question of established that you can generate more tax base through the investment in the infrastructure or through reimbursement than you get otherwise if you didn't participate as a public sector partner in the infrastructure. And so it basically was a economic question that if the city and county were willing to reimburse a certain level of property taxes and sales taxes, what was the present view of the total taxes over the next 20 or 25 years can be higher than if they didn't, because the infrastructure needed for that more dense mixed-use environment would probably never have been invested in by the private sector by themselves, because they probably wouldn't have been able to make a profit in a short enough period of time to justify the investment, and it would have been much lower density with a resulting smaller tax base. So we showed the but for that their reimbursement commitment, which is a higher level than that present value of tax base, as opposed to them not participating. In other words, this is a short-handed way of saying I think it's to the public benefit from an economic development standpoint to hopefully someday have the Utah legislature go back and liberalize that standard and put an economic test on it versus a blight test.
Scott, last question, and it's one that's a little bit theoretical, but I know it's something that you've thought a lot about because we discussed it privately. And it is looking back with a little bit of hindsight with the recession that we've been through. We have a very different economic environment today than we did a decade ago. And I guess my question to you from the standpoint of an economic development strategy is what do you see in terms of base code helping to bridge the hurdles that we had by virtue of the conventional zoning impacts that were part of what we had to deal with from a recession standpoint?
Well, I mean, I think our recession was a real estate recession. A lot of real estate that was designed, invested in, and constructed was more about sources of funding being available and the selling debt in the secondary and tertiary securities market versus the intrinsic demand and value of real estate in neighborhoods. I think what form-based approach does is it actually creates a real test to say, is there real demand, and if it's executed properly, people are more and more wanting neighborhood and walkable mixed-use environments, whether they're in small resort communities or in the heart of reinvented central city areas like the developing industrial areas of downtown Salt Lake City. And I think what it is it's basically a risk test on what the market really wants versus what selling might occur in terms of bubbles. I think this sounds a little far-fetched. Realizing form-based on a greater scale actually I think will be reducing the risk of overheating and overselling and overinvesting, because form-based really gets you into the essential character of a neighborhood and the demand for that neighborhood, and then only then will those investments be made. And those neighborhoods are going to be reinventing themselves over time, so you're not burdening the public sector tax base because you have obsolescence of neighborhoods or positive product in a too short a period of time. So I actually think it can help smooth the development cycles of our country because it actually aligns real value with demand with real investment. From an economic development standpoint, I basically think it creates more authentic investment and thereby reduces the risk of creating bubbles in the sectors of our economy, which the traditional, more conventional zoning enforces. Basically, we're building things that people didn't want, and there was a little bit of it for a while, and then whole neighborhoods or whole retail centers would go belly up. Based allows us to actually do something more nuanced. Thank you.
Scott, thank you so much for your time. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot to look at here in market here in Utah. Just a reminder for those that aren't familiar with the format of our webinars, this webinar has been recorded, and we will share a link to the recording of this webinar on the Facebook page. Please find us there if you'd like to either listen to it or share it with someone that may have missed it. If you have an opportunity to participate in the Form-Based Code Institute 301 course, registration ends tomorrow. I hope you'd take advantage of that. There's a $50 discount if you register as part of early bird registration. Please join us if you can. From all of us here in Salt Lake City, we say thank you, Scott, and look forward to future interactions with you and hopefully at CNU 23.
Thank you very much.